there was an incident which someone pointed out to me, which happened in Britain, where a woman tried to commit suicide by taking an overdose. And when she was discovered, they called the doctors, and the doctor could not resuscitate the woman, and so he subsequently pronounced her dead, and she was taken to the morgue. There was no pulse, no breathing, and she was placed in a body bag, and then as she was about to be put into the refrigerator, this was many hours after the pronouncement of her death, one of the workers who was about to place her in the refrigerator for keeping the body before the cremation noticed there was some movement in the bag, and subsequently opened the bag to check and found out that actually she was breathing and she had actually recovered. And so subsequently she was taken off to hospital and she had a complete recovery. Another very interesting story, a true story, which was pointed out to me on a similar lines, happened in the Ukraine, where an elderly gentleman had a heart attack. The doctors were called. He was pronounced dead. His body was taken off to the morgue, and the family grieved, had a wake for 3 days. The casket was open for 3 days during the wake. Then after the 3 days, the casket was shut and taken off to the cemetery. And the tradition there was to put the casket in a crypt underground in storage. And so this was done. And from the time of death, 11 days later, some of the people working in the crypt noticed some noise coming out of this coffin. And this noise got louder and louder. And so they took the coffin down, opened it up, and this gentleman stood up and got out. He was in his late 70s. And he subsequently asked for a drink. He was quite thirsty. Being the Ukraine, they probably gave him vodka. And then he walked home, which his house wasn't very far away, knocked on his front door. His family had got over their grief and had subsequently, I think, split up the inheritance. They went to the front door, opened the front door, and found grandfather standing there. Of course, that was a bit of a shock. It actually said in the article that they slammed the front door, and obviously they thought that it was some sort of ghost or some experience that they could not explain. He persisted on knocking. Finally, they opened the front door, and the reaction of the family was they were incredibly upset that he had recovered, because they had actually gone through the grief process and finally, after 11 days, had accepted that grandfather had gone on. And then suddenly there he was, back again. Another sidelight of this story was that this fellow, because he was officially dead, had a hard time proving to the authorities that he was now alive and couldn't get his pension back, and on all the government stats, he was listed as dead. Now, the reason I mentioned these stories is firstly to get your attention, and secondly because tonight I wanted to talk about the death and dying process, and particularly the topic of rebirth. For all of us, the process of death and the process of dying is probably the most crucial problem that we're going to face, and we have faced. And so it is very important to actually look at this problem, and we see that most religious institutions or most religious teachings tackle this fundamental question. And basically the idea of an afterlife, or the non-idea of an afterlife, that is, that there is no afterlife, is a crucial question that we should be asking and inquiring into. And if we want to understand any religious teachings, we need to understand what do they teach about this, because our attitude and view on this greatly influences our behaviour here and now. For example, if we don't believe in an afterlife, we have a materialistic view or a annihilationist view that after the death of this body, that's it, there's nothing more, then that will influence the way we behave, think and act here and now. We may be directed towards seeking as much pleasure and gratification in the shortest possible time, because we don't know when we're going to go. Or if we have the idea that, for example, there is an afterlife, then that will affect our behaviour. We'll be concerned to make sure that our behaviour leads to a good afterlife. So, firstly, I want to discuss the basic three teachings that we find in the world, or three attitudes that we find in the world, three views that people have towards death and what happens after death. And the first one, as I mentioned, is the materialistic view. And before I was a biologist, before I came across Buddhism, and I had this view, I accepted that this body is just a process of chemical processes, an accumulation of atoms, and that our thoughts are just a process of chemical interactions. And for example, if we have too much, say, testosterone running through the blood, you may get too angry, too upset or excited, and you could explain many emotions, interactions, or responses in terms of chemical processes. But this is basically, I find, unsatisfactory in the sense that it explains what happens in the body, but it doesn't explain why it happens. And this is one of the great weaknesses I've found from a materialistic or biological attitude of what human existence is. But the annihilationist process or attitude in view is that at the death moment, death occurs through accident or when the body cannot sustain life, and therefore that is the end. And one of the other problems with the materialistic view is it never explains why we come out of, say, nothing, or come out of, say, the chemical processes and the natural forces in the world, out of nature, live for 30, 40, 50, 60 years and then cease. To me that is an unsatisfactory explanation. It seems actually, when one considers it, absurd, but it is very prevalent in the society. The next view on the attitude of life after death is that there is, and that's usually presented by, say, the theistic traditions, for example, the Orthodox Christian traditions, the Orthodox Judaist traditions, the Orthodox Islamic traditions, that there is eternal life after death. We have a single life. Then at the death process, according to our actions during this single life, we are born in eternal heaven or in damnation, in hell. That is one view as well. The other view the third view is what is usually found in both Hinduism and Buddhism. That is, that there is a continuous process of life, growth, aging and death, then rebirth, life, growth, aging and death, then rebirth, going on endlessly into the future, and it has gone on from time immemorial. Now, there are distinctions between the way this is presented. In the Hindu tradition, the attitude is that there is a permanent soul, a consciousness. And that soul, that consciousness, at the time of death, it discards one body and then takes up another. And then when that body stops functioning, it takes up another body. And this soul continues on continuously until it is unified with what we call, what the Hindus call, higher consciousness or Atman or Brahman or Godhead, whatever you want to call it. That is actually how it's defined, as this ongoing process, and it is usually called reincarnation. And in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the classical text of the Hindu tradition, it is given, the simile is given of a person who is wearing a set of clothing. When the set of clothing gets old and ragged, then they discard that set of clothes and put on a new set of clothes. But the thing that is constant is the person putting on the clothes, not the clothes. And they compare that to the soul. It discards one body when that gets old and stops functioning, and then they take up another body. Now, that is quite different from the Buddhist idea of rebirth. And the Buddha presented rebirth as a part of his teaching, and he presented this as his explanation of the life process, the death process, and the reasons why it happens. And so this evening I would like to discuss and talk about some aspects of the Buddhist concept of rebirth for your consideration. And it doesn't matter if you don't believe in rebirth, because as I saw on a car sticker once, it said, "Don't worry if you don't believe in rebirth, next life you will." which I thought was quite quaint. But seriously, for our consideration on the concept of rebirth, we actually have to develop an understanding firstly of the idea that the Buddha explained about life. And to understand rebirth, one actually has to understand what we call life and what we call a human being. And the way the Buddha broke up the human being was into its units, its characteristics, its bases. And he broke up the human being into 5 bases. Firstly, there is the material base, that is the body. And this is where Buddhism and science are one. There's no problem with Buddhism, with scientific view, when it's taken from the material base of view. That is that this body is made up of its parts, its atoms, its elements, its chemical processes. But all human experience cannot be explained just in terms of body and chemical processes. There are other aspects of human experience which are beyond that. And then the Buddha divided those up into 4 other areas, which he called mind. The first one he called body, which is rupa in Pali, and the next aspect was mind, which is nama. And these are very important to understand, to define and clearly comprehend what we are. Because if we don't know what we take ourselves to be, then we can never be liberated from that. And the next aspect, the mind aspect, he saw that there was 4 characteristics, 4 bases of that. First is feeling, and the feeling characteristic, Vedana, which is the pleasant bodily feeling, unpleasant bodily feeling, neutral bodily feeling, pleasant mental feeling, unpleasant mental feeling or moods, and neutral mental feelings, neutral thoughts. Then he divided the next section up into what we call thoughts, as the thinking process. The next, prior to that actually, is perception, where we perceive, we see, and we label. We see the carpet, we label it with a name, carpet. Actually, what we're seeing is just colour and form. But because of conventional labeling and our conditioning, we label it. That is the perception. Then we can start thinking about the carpet, and that is conception. And then the last one is, after that, consciousness. Consciousness in Buddhism does not mean a soul. It does not mean an underlying consciousness. Consciousness means that process of knowing, and that process of knowing is constantly arising and ceasing in the present moment. And any person who has done insight meditation, you will have noticed that our ability to know something arises and ceases in the present moment. We are constantly being bombarded with sense impressions, and that stimulates our consciousness. So we have eye consciousness when we see something. Yes. There's an object outside, there's contact with the working eye organ, and when that contact occurs, then eye consciousness arises. And the same occurs with sound, contacting. There's a sound outside, there's got to be an organ to hear that sound, and then there is hearing consciousness arises. And just on this, I'd like to ask you a question, which is a famous philosophical question. If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one to hear it, is there any sound? Just think about that for a while. If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one to hear it, is there any sound? From a Buddhist point of view, there isn't. Because there's no sound to be heard, then it's as if it is non-existent. Yes. It's only heard when there is the object that's causing the sound, the waves, that causes the waves, the vibrations in the air, and then there's an ear organ, a working ear organ. A deaf person doesn't hear the tree falling down, therefore for them there is no sound. They may feel the vibrations of the tree falling down, but they feel vibrations. Therefore they associate that, but they don't hear the sound. So for the deaf person, the tree falling in the forest, there is no sound. Or if there is no person to hear, then there is no sound. Sound is only cognized and known when there is the falling of the object, the sound waves created, a good ear receiving that, and then the cognition of the mind, that the person is conscious. A person who is in a state of unconsciousness would not hear the sound. The person in the second jhana, a deep state of meditation absorption, if a tree fell next to them, would not also hear the sound. So In this way, consciousness is dependent on certain conditions. Now, that is true for all the other 5 senses and the 6th sense of mind. Now, the next aspect that the Buddha talked about in understanding this life process is that human existence is an interaction between the body, the physical, and the mind, but the mind is the forerunner. And what occurs in this process is mind is an ongoing process of what we call in Pali citta, which is thought or mind consciousness, cognition, and it is an aspect of cognition of contact of the senses. So these constant changing moments of citta, it is not a constant individual self or entity. The Buddha describes a being as this ongoing process of change. These 5 units which are interacting, that is body, feeling, perception, thought and consciousness interacting, causing these moments of citta, and these moments of citta develop a habit pattern because they are conditioned from the past. So the idea of person that we have is actually this association of certain habit patterns. And these certain habit patterns is what we call character, isn't it? This is what we remember of a person. They're a good character, a happy character, or a not so good character. It's this habit patterns that we develop which we associate with a particular person. We like this person because of their nice character, or we don't like this person because they're grumpy or whatever. And so it's these habit patterns of our citta, these ongoing processes which stimulate new habit patterns to occur. And this is important why we can actually change our habit patterns. There can be a changing of those habit patterns in a wholesome direction, or a development of habit patterns in an unwholesome direction. Now, this is to describe what we call as this process of being. Now, to understand how this affects the life-death process, it's necessary for us to maybe give an example of what I mean. A lot of people find it difficult to conceptualize when you say that there is no ultimate self there. Because on a conventional level, we take this as me, don't we? Take this body as mine, we take this consciousness as mine, we take these thoughts as mine. But on an ultimate level, it's not a self. It is a constant changing process of interacting thoughts, consciousness, perception, and feelings, and also the interaction of the body. Now, when we actually see that, we can look at, say, a simile, just as, say, a scientist would say, ultimately, this bell doesn't exist. A physicist would actually have to say that actually it is just a makeup of atoms, yes? Or even, if he was going to break it down, a collection of quasars interacting, elements interacting, yes? But on a conventional level, the scientist would say, yes, this bell does exist, yes? But on an ultimate level, it is made up of this interaction of elements. And then when you start to look at it more closely, where is the cut-off boundary between the elements of oxygen in the air and the surface of the metal elements in this bell? And on the atomic level, you cannot say that there is a definite defining line. But on the conventional level, yes, we can see that. And this is true when we look at this idea of self. On the conventional level, yes, it is true. Even the Buddha himself used the term Tathagata to refer to himself, meaning the thus gone one. He used a pronoun just for conventional usage. But on the ultimate level, it is the being, the thing that we call self, is actually just this makeup of these 5 base interaction aggregates. And a simile of that is, for example, the candles here. This is a simile that the Buddha gave, that the candles here and the flame of the candles is actually dependent for its existence on an interacting process. For example, the light of that candle is dependent on the sustenance of the wax, the existence of the wick to hold it, to sustain it, and the interaction with oxygen brought up to a certain temperature. And when those conditions are there, then a flame exists. When those conditions are not there, then the flame goes out. In the example of the rebirth process, the Buddha gave that analogy. It is similar to this candle is burning down after a certain length of time, and we bring a new candle to it, and we light that flame from the old candle onto the new candle, and this flame goes out. Now, can we say that the new flame is the same as the old? Obviously not, because the new flame is dependent on new wax. That wax is constantly burning at a certain temperature. The wick is constantly changing. The oxygen is constantly changing. And the flame, if you watch that candle long enough, is constantly in a state of flickering and changing. So it is not true, ultimately, to say it is the same flame. But it is true to say it is dependent on the previous flame for its existence. And this is true in the process and the explanation of the rebirth process, is that what happens, the human existence is this ongoing process of citta, mind, which is constantly taking its causal conditions from the past on into the present, onto certain habits, and these habits of the mind is motivated by our desires. And this is what we call in Pali tanha. Tanha is this craving, and there are 3 forms of craving which cause certain habits which will perpetuate further existence. It is the force, it is the fuel, it is the wax of the candle. Tanha, craving, is the energy which takes us on to further existence, because the mind is a powerful force, and it is the craving for sensuality, the craving for sensual pleasures, sensual enjoyment. That is a very powerful force. You see how much of our energy and effort is put into seeking pleasure for the body. So we seek comfort, we seek fullness, we seek contentment, and we're looking for happiness, pleasurable experiences for the body. And that desire for pleasurable experiences is a motivating force which develops certain habit patterns. That's how we live a certain lifestyle to fulfill that happiness. And we take up certain occupations in order to get the sustenance to fulfill that happiness. And when we don't get them, then we're unhappy, we're discontent, we're suffering. And so this first sensual craving, the next craving which perpetuates life, is actually the craving for existence, the craving to be, the craving to become, the craving to create. And this is a very strong craving. And you notice that, for example, in people who are very sick, just the willpower to exist, the willpower to live, can perpetuate life in this existence on. They can live a lot longer just with that strong desire to live. And you often find that, and it's quite well documented medically, that people who have, say, a terminal illness, but they have an important event coming up, for example, a wedding anniversary or a birthday or the gathering together of family, which is very important to them, then they will often live to that time and then quickly, very shortly afterwards, pass away. And it's this power of the mind to will the body to exist further, to live longer. It's a strength of mind. This strength of mind continues on after death because it has created the pattern for it to continue on after death, the causal condition for it to continue on after death to the next life. It doesn't end, from a Buddhist point of view, at the point of death. And the last craving, which actually perpetuates new existence, is the craving not to exist. And this is the craving for annihilationism, the craving to end suffering, to get away from pain. And you see that just in the movement of the body. As we sit here, we crave to get away from the discomfort of sitting when it gets painful. When we get a headache, we take an aspirin to get rid of the pain. When we have intense suffering, we want to get rid of it, put an end. And some people go to the extreme of when they have very intense suffering, they want to end life. So they choose to take their life. That is this craving for non-existence. Unfortunately, this power of mind to destroy existence, get away from existence, is the exact opposite of the craving for existence, and actually is an energy in itself, which motivates people to kill themselves. But unfortunately, from a Buddhist point of view, that leads to the perpetuation of a new existence. And just a side point on that, from a Buddhist point of view, that explains why they would have the tendency in the next life to want to commit suicide as well, because of that habit. It is seeking a way out of suffering. Therefore, it is not an escape in itself. It develops a habit, just as any habits that we develop are hard to break. If we develop good habits, then they're hard to break. If we develop bad habits, then they are very hard to break. Because of the conditioned nature of mind, we tend to fall into that same way of reacting to our experience because that's how we've always acted according to that experience. So this leads on to the same reaction. And so these three forms of craving are the motivators, the energy, the fuel for further becoming. And the reason that at the point of death, from a Buddhist point of view, when the mind is going to leave or come to an end, this mind process is coming to an end, it's an ongoing arising and ceasing of mind, the body is not able to sustain it any further, the body breaks up, then there is what we call rebirth linking consciousness arising. Now, before I'll go on to that, I just want to say a bit about actually this death process, because this is a very interesting thing. And before I actually do that, I want to ask if people in the audience would like to put their hands up. Who has had a near-death experience? Is anyone in here? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay, we've had 3 people. So that's That's not the average, actually. It's usually actually much higher than that. And what you find is that in near-death experiences there tends to be certain common sort of experiences which occur. And because these common experiences actually are very similar to meditative absorption experiences. So anyone who's, say, experienced in the jhanas, the meditative higher absorptions of concentration, understands much more clearly the death process and therefore loses their fear of the death process, just as someone who has gone through a new death experience. Often you'll find that they are not afraid of death so much because they have a more understanding of that process because of that experience of it. And some of the common factors is you'll find in the death process is firstly the body, the physical body starts to shut down. So movement, for example, the inability to move the body. Then there is the sense of the body, the mind is actually detaching from the body. There's a sense of disinterest in the body, disconcern with the body. And what happens then is after that disinterest and concern with the body, then the mind turns towards the experiences of the mind. And often there is a sense of buoyancy, a sense of lightness, a sense of everything's okay. And as this process goes on, often people start to experience a bright light. And through other people's experiences, you hear people talking about them seeing their life flash before them. This is what, from a Buddhist point of view, we call the experience of seeing karma, one's actions in the past. And often then it goes on to the mind leaving the body, and then there's this experience of going through a tunnel or towards a bright light, and then some people have other visionary experiences which go on from that. Now, from a Buddhist point of view, this is not a person or a soul going down this dark tunnel, but it is a process of the mind consciousness gradually giving up certain habit patterns and associations with this world, and they are rising and ceasing during that experience. And what is happening is that the mind firstly starts to give up these sense organs. And so you'll find that the visual experience starts to cease, and it's just visionary experience, perception. And the last sense organ to close down is the ear. And that is why it is very important never to show the sadness or grief around a dying person. It's much better to give them encouragement, support, and be very positive, because often you may not be aware of it. They are not functioning. We may say that they're unconscious, but actually they can often still hear. And because of that, if you show grief, and that will lead to the arising of this craving, this desire, an attachment for, say, the people they are leaving behind. And because of that craving, if it's time for the body to break up, that craving and attachment will become so strong that they cannot renounce that, and therefore it will lead to further becoming in the next life. What happens when the thought consciousness ceases in this life is then, as the candle, the simile of the candle, when you take it onto another candle, the flame goes over to one candle, it starts off the patterns for a new life. But this rebirth linking consciousness, which links one life to the next, can only occur when there is the right conditions. And the right conditions, of course, is that there has to be an ovum, it has to be fertilized, and then when that ovum and fertilization occurs, then the consciousness can arise. And this is the moment that we call conception. And then at that time of conception, then consciousness can arise in those cells, and that's the process that we call birth in Buddhism. Birth in Buddhism is not the actual process of coming out of the womb, but actually birth into the womb. That's how the Buddha defined birth. Is actually when consciousness arises in the womb. And this is perpetuated on. Now, one can ask, well, why? Why? And as I said earlier, the reason why is because of this energy of craving. And the reason we have this when we have this desire for pleasure, that desire of pleasure is motivated by seeking out pleasant feelings. Pleasant feelings through the eyes, pleasant sights, pleasant sounds, pleasant tastes, pleasant touch, pleasant smells, pleasant thoughts. Now, when we're seeking pleasure, then we're seeking also the contact with that pleasure. So we're seeking certain experiences which will give us pleasure. So when we want pleasant feelings, we'll seek out certain experiences which will give us the contact with those pleasant experiences. Now, when we're seeking out the contact with certain experiences, then we've got to have the sense organs as a basis to receive those experiences. Now, when we're seeking out the sense organs to experience pleasure, then we've got to have a body, an organism, which will give us those sense organs, which will give us that contact, which will give us the feeling, which will satisfy our desires. And so we seek a new body. And the seeking of this new body is motivated by the volition of the mind moving towards this desire for fulfillment. And that is caused by its lack of understanding of this process. And so with a lack of understanding that all phenomena is impermanent, all phenomena is unsatisfactory, all phenomena is not a personalized self, and all phenomena is not beautiful, then when we don't understand that, then we'll have this seeking out for permanency, seeking out for security, seeking out for pleasure, seeking out for a gratification of self and an identification with self and an attachment to the beauty that is associated with self. And it is this lack of understanding which leads and drives one on. And this is what the Buddha called the dependent origination. This is how causally conditioned beings arise. And it is a process which goes on. And it doesn't stop until one cuts off the cause. And the cause for future rebirth is craving. Is craving for sense pleasure, a craving for existence, or the craving for non-existence. And that is why the Buddha talked about his spiritual path, the Buddha's teachings, as a path to the ending of craving. Now, when craving comes to an end, then all the other factors come to an end. Because it is causally conditioned. And when you take one thing away, then the other things must come to an end. For example, when we take the wax away of the candle, then the flame must go out, because there is not the conditions for it to exist. And it is true with craving. When we take craving away, it's come to an end, then there is not the condition for further becoming. Now, this is how the Buddha described this process of rebirth, that having been born, then one grows old, sick and dies, but then if there is still the craving in the mind, then that will be the energy, the driving force, to seek another body to satisfy that craving. And this is not too dissimilar from, for example, if we have a very strong desire tonight, before we go to bed, yes, tomorrow I want to do something, yes, specific. You have a very strong intention and desire. Then when we go to bed, what happens then? It's not that the mind actually stops functioning, it's the body which actually rests, isn't it? And that's why sleep is getting close to a death experience. Yes, the body starts to slow down, the breathing becomes much more mild, the automatic processes of the body take over, but consciousness is still working. Thoughts are still working. That's why we dream. Dream is just an overactive mind. That's why if you develop very good states of concentration of mind, you won't dream. Yes. Condition for us to remember that, and then, oh yes, I want to do that. And this is this conditioned process which carries over from one day to the next. And it carries over from one life to the next. And the process of rebirth, if one considers it and contemplates it, then it does explain, I think, for myself, a lot more rationally and logically, that things are a process. It's not, as the annihilationist or materialistic point of view would say, we arise out of a soupy broth at the beginning of earth, and there's this haphazard interaction of elements and chemical processes, and we just happen to, through a process of evolution, accidentally develop into this human being. And then at the end of it we're going to cease, and that's it. That I find very unsatisfactory, but many of you may find that explains some aspects of your experience. Or the other process where we're created by a deity, a God, for one life, experience on earth, and then at the end of that there is eternal afterlife. One can still ask, well, why? It doesn't really explain why. But many people obviously feel very comfortable with that. Whereas from the Buddhist point of view, it is actually, what we're doing is breaking down the process and seeing the patterns. And this is why obviously we do not know our past lives unless we have a psychic power to remember those, and we don't know where we're going to go on in the future. But what we can do through meditation is actually see the tendency of mind and the energy of craving, how that creates certain habit patterns in the mind, and that those habit patterns and tendencies propel us through life, sometimes completely without knowing. We do some things purely out of habit, and sometimes our interaction with other beings, other people, other experiences is a compulsive reaction, because we've always reacted in that way. And this is what leads to, say, prejudice. We prejudge an experience through our other experiences in relation to that similar situation. So this process of rebirth is actually one of the aspects of right view, what we call sammaditthi in Buddhism, because what it does is it actually turns you back towards taking responsibility for one's own existence. In our societies these days, we tend to, because we have accepted a materialistic explanation of experience from the scientific point of view, we often are passing off responsibility of our volition and our intention and our actions onto others or onto a chemical process. For example, we often explain, say, certain criminal experiences like very, very violent crimes. They have found that there is, say, a genetic makeup of the chromosomes, too many chromosomes coming together, two of the male chromosomes coming together in certain violent criminals, and that is going to increase the testosterone, which is going to make them naturally more aggressive. That's true, but also that's just explaining the biological process, but it doesn't explain the volition and the intention of mind, which is the motivator. So it says what happens, but it also doesn't say why. And it can lead to the lack of responsibility for one's action. And that is always very dangerous because one actually has to take responsibility. And we see from this process of it is what we want, what we're desiring for, or what we don't want. When that is motivated by greed or hatred or delusion, then our intentions are going to be unwholesome. And that is going to direct us in an unskillful way. And we're going to act in an unskillful way. Whereas if one accepts a possibility, yes, well, even the possibility there is an afterlife, whether one accepts a theistic possibility or the Hindu possibility or the Buddhist possibility, then that immediately affects one's action here and now. If one thinks that if I behave in a skillful way, then there's going to be a reward in the future, then it's going to be a motivator to act in a more skillful and more wholesome way. And the Buddha actually once presented it. He was talking about karma and rebirth, that is the principle of action and its results and the re-life that occurs because of the results, to a group of people, and he said, well, possibly you don't believe in rebirth. It's something you don't know. It's something we all here can say we don't know. But he presented it this way: supposing that it is true, and because you take the possibility that rebirth is true, that there is a life after death, then, and one acts well now, skillfully now, wholesomely now, then one experiences happiness and pleasure here and now, and then after death one will experience happiness and pleasure. If one accepts the possibility that rebirth is true, but it proves that it's not true, it actually isn't true, then but one believes it is true, then one will act skillfully and wholesomely here and now, and therefore experience the pleasure of that, the pleasure of doing kind acts, having no conflict, doing things motivated by compassion and goodness. There is a pleasure and happiness there, a peace there. One experiences that. Then afterlife, if there's no afterlife, then at least one has experienced pleasure in this life, here and now. So that is why actually an idea of an afterlife is actually hedging your bets. Yes? It actually is, it is a cause and an influence for happiness and pleasure here and now, and happiness and pleasure, if there is an afterlife, in the future. And so it logically makes more sense. And that is an interesting thing to reflect on. I wanted to present this teaching on rebirth, and in a couple of weeks' time I'll be coming back again, and I wanted to actually talk about the other aspect of this subject, which is kamma, which means action, because they're very interrelated, that how one acts and what one does affects one's rebirth. And this principle of kamma of the Buddhas explains why beings are different. And it was in response to a question that from a young man who came to the Buddha and asked, why are some people wealthy, some people poor, some people happy, some people sad, some people born beautiful, some people born ugly. What is the explanation for the difference and diversity of human beings and human experience? And the Buddha taught the principle of kamma, the principle of it is the action of individuals that lead to differences, and differences of experience and differences in the future experiences that they will receive, the results of those actions. But I'll leave that for a future date. Is there any questions on the general area of the topic that I spoke about this evening? Yes. Actually, that's a very good question, because the Tibetan teaching of the Bardo is getting a lot of interest, and there's been a number of programs on it. I understand both on television. There's a number of books out. In the Theravada tradition, which is the tradition of the Pali Canon, which is one of the oldest tradition, the Buddha actually does categorically say in the Tripitaka that there is no individual in-between. There is no in-between state. That once one thought moment ceases, the last thought moment ceases in this lifetime, then if there is still craving for existence, then there must be rebirth linking consciousness arising. The next thought consciousness must arise, and that will lead to immediate rebirth. Now, whether that rebirth is in a human realm, or in a deva realm, or in a spirit realm, depends on the kamma, the action of that individual in this life and in previous lives before this. So, from a Theravada point of view, no, there is no in-between state. It must cause an instantaneous relinking consciousness arising in the next life. And that is actually why sometimes the dying process actually is drawn out, because it is not ripe to be reborn. One is not ripe. There's not the right conditions for one to take a rebirth, because one has actually got to take rebirth from this life into the next life into circumstances which is appropriate to one, according to one's behaviour and actions. If one's going to take another human rebirth, then, for example, it's got to be the time of conception too, when the rebirth-linking consciousness can arise in a new womb at fertilization. So, from a Buddhist point of view, no, there is not an in-between state, from the Theravada tradition point of view, I should say. That's badly worded, because if you just go into a realm for another rebirth, it implies that there is a being going to a realm for another rebirth. And that's the crux of the Buddhist teachings is it is not an entity or a being which leaves this body, goes out, hangs in the air, and then finds another body to be reborn in. It is not that. It is a conditioned process. When this body experiences the interaction between mind, body, perception, thought and consciousness, which is going on all the time, that interaction ceases, then it'll cause and be the spark for the arising of a new existence. A very coarse simile may be, for example, like when we start the motor of our car and the engine is running, then conventionally we say the engine is running, yes? Right? Now actually what is actually happening when the engine is running is the pistons are going up and down all the time, fuel is going in, and there's a spark there, isn't there, of the spark plug. And that's igniting the fuel, and that's the force, the energy that drives the pistons down, and it comes up, and that's constantly going on. Now that spark, and that's this interaction of this process. If one of those, say the spark plug's not working or the fuel's not injected, then the engine may die. Yes? Right? If the conditions are right, we restart the engine with this intention to start the engine, and all those conditions are right, then the engine will start running again. Now this rebirth linking consciousness is the spark which starts off the new life, right? Kicks over the engine, yes? And causes the engine to run. And when it runs out of fuel, then the engine stops again. So we have to. So that's a fairly coarse simile, but maybe that helps in that analogy. It's not a being that goes from this life. That is the Hindu idea. That is a being that goes from this life, may hang around for a while and actually go into a new life. There's actually a causal condition. And that's, yes, okay, I'll stop on it. Yes, sorry. Yes. Yes, actually that's a very crucial point, and that's actually one of the things I haven't gone into tonight, because as I said I was going to talk about that in detail in 2 weeks' time. The reason is because of our actions here and now, firstly affect the here and now, don't they? How we volitionally, intentionally act in this, say, group here affects everybody here. We are all interdependent in this room. If I say something which is unpleasant or unskillful, then that's going to affect all of you. And if you do something that is unskillful or unwholesome, then that's going to affect everybody here. Or if I do something vice versa, if I say something kind or do something skillful, then that affects everybody. So there's in the here and now, our behaviour affects us and affects all those around us. And so for the experience of life here and now, the reason that it is beneficial to live a skillful life and do good actions is because it is beneficial for myself here and now, it is beneficial for others, and it is beneficial for both. So that's something I can know here and now. But the other reason is because how I act here and now develops certain behaviour patterns and certain tendencies, our character. And it's interesting because I went to a funeral just on Monday, and that's actually something I said, that when the person is dead, what we remember them is not the body, how they looked at the time of death in the coffin, or their last moment. We may have a visual impression, but that's pretty hazy. What we remember about them is their character, their personality, their acts of kindness or whatever. And that's what we remember. So it's these tendencies and habit patterns develop a character. And in that character, that develops this energy which carries over into the new life and will be the cause for the new life. And this is the energy, the action, karma, causes a result. And it is that result which will determine whether we have a good rebirth or an unpleasant rebirth. And so this is something that one can actually see through one's just investigation of experience here and now, and also through meditation. When one meditates, one sees this interaction much more subtly, much more delicately. And so one becomes much more skillful in the way one interacts with other people, because we see the effect on one and one's other people as well. We become more sensitive. I've tried to answer that very briefly. I don't know whether that's satisfactory, but it is a big area, the area of karma, action, and how that actually influences rebirth. But unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all the details of that, so maybe in 2 weeks' time. Yes. That's a good question. The question was, how should one prepare one's mind before death? This is also going into my topic next fortnight. I think I'm going to run out of things to say, but that's actually a very good question, because there's certain things which influence the new life, and it depends on one's action in this life. If one has done, say, very heavy, unwholesome karma, or what we call in Buddhism, the Buddha called it black karma. For example, one has killed one's parents. These are the worst karma actions you can do according to the Buddha. Killed one's parents, killed an enlightened person, caused a schism in the Sangha, or injured a Buddha, then that is heavy karma. There's an automatic rebirth in the hell realms. Yes? That's the heaviest. Most of us have never done that, right? So the Buddha gave this comparison to a simile, like you've got a cow herd, a herd of cattle, and you've got them in a corral. You've got them in a corral. And if you open the gate of the corral, now usually what happens in that cow herd, if you have a bull, a large strong bull which is the leader of the herd, then that will normally lead the herd of cattle out as soon as you open the gate. And the Buddha gave that simile as anyone who has very strong, heavy karma, then it'll be that karma at the last moment of death which leads to the rebirth. It will fruit straight away. And the opposite, if one has heavy good karma, for example, one has made, say, an offering to a fully enlightened being, yes? One has done something very strong, that is very good, and one has made an offering to a Buddha, for example, then that heavy, strong, good karma must lead one on to the next life in a good way, and one will have a good rebirth. But supposing that there's no heavy, strong karma, either way, wholesome or unwholesome, either black or white, then it's like the corral. We open the gate, there's no bull who leads the herd, then you'll find that the habitual leader of the herd, it may be a cow who's an older cow who habitually has led that herd, will go out the gate first. And that cow leads out the gate. And the Buddha compared that in that simile to, if you have no heavy good or bad karma, heavy black or white karma, then it's your habitual actions in this life, and in habitual actions in past lives, which will lead you out onto the next life. So if you've habitually done unskillful actions, body, speech and mind, being a habitual killer, being a habitual stealer, for example, then that will lead to rebirth. Yes? If one has habitual good karma, one has done acts of kindness, one has done acts of goodness, acts of generosity, then that will lead you on in the next life, and one will have a good rebirth. Now, supposing you don't have any habitual wholesome or unwholesome, but it's a mixture, right? It's pretty much a blend. And the Buddha compared it to you open the gate of the corral with your cows in, and it's the one nearest to the gate that goes out first, yes? And the Buddha compared it to a person who has a mixture of actions in their lives, both good and bad, and it'll be the last thought moment which will critically influence the new life. Because it is the last thought moment which will be the spark which leads on to the igniting of the new life. Yes? And that is what the rebirth linking consciousness will be motivated by, would be the last thought moment. And that is why I said, and this comes back to your question, that it's very important to create the right atmosphere around a dying person. And I think for those people who have had, say, near-death experiences, they'll be very aware of this. Excuse me, I'll just put this back. They'll be very aware of this because, as I said, the last faculty to close down is the ear consciousness. So they can seem completely unconscious. A dying person can be seeming completely unconscious, cannot move their body, cannot open their eyes, cannot do anything, cannot talk, but they can still hear, and they can still hear what's going on. So if you're creating an atmosphere which is conducive for them to develop a wholesome last thought moment, then that will often be the stimulus for them to have a wholesome rebirth. If you're creating an atmosphere which is oppressive, grieved, saddened, or negative, then that can be a cause, if they can still hear that, for them to have, say, a sad thought as their last thought moment, and then have an unwholesome rebirth. And that is also why, for Buddhists, often they will give up taking any drugs prior to or getting close to death, especially heavy drugs like morphine. That is actually not good to die under the influence of very heavy drugs, because you can be in a very hallucinating state, which can be your last thought moment at the time of death, and therefore badly influence your future rebirth. And so if it is possible to endure the pain very close to death, it is much better to die lucidly, even though one is dying in very intense pain, but to lucidly investigate that pain and know that pain. And you'll find actually when the death process occurs, then the mind actually separates from the pain and it doesn't become a problem. So if you can endure up to that point, then that is very good, because it will influence your last thought moment, which is very crucial for the next life. One more question? Yes. The point that I was making on that question was that if you just define action as a chemical process of interaction between, say, elements and chemicals, then people lose responsibility for action. As soon as people lose responsibility for action, then they are not taking on the consequences of their action. Therefore don't become responsible for it. And that is ethically very dangerous ground to get on. And that is why then people start to blame themselves and see themselves as victims. I'm a victim of my chemicals. Yes? So if I want to get up and abuse people and hurt people, then it's just chemical processes going on in my brains and I'm not responsible, and It's just this interaction of the elements and nature. So that, on an ethical point of view and a philosophical point of view, is very dangerous ground, and actually becomes a justification of irresponsibility. So from a Buddhist point of view, the Buddha actually criticized that, the annihilationist point of view and materialist point of view, as actually ethically extremely dangerous wrong view, because you can lead to a lot of justifications for action using that viewpoint. And it's how you look at something, how you view something, your attitude towards something, that affects your behaviour, doesn't it? And so there is a danger there. It is not to deny that the body and the chemical process influence the mind. The Buddha never denied that. That's why I said in the 5 aggregates that the Buddha talked about, the first one is body. But the body is, that has an influence on the mind. For example, when the body gets sick, that does affect us, doesn't it? But the mind is the forerunner, and it is mind which chooses to act. And that's where we have to place moral responsibility on. What made you do that? Why did you do that? And it cannot be explained away purely by chemical processes. That can have an influence, but it is motivated by mind. Does that answer your question? Yes. That's actually another interesting point, because that does lead often in our society now. There is a tendency, because of the materialistic viewpoint, to say, well, we are actually victims of, say, our environment, victims of our parents, victims of our schooling, victims of our society. That is correct, but it's not true. It is correct in the sense that, yes, our environmental experiences does affect us, but we choose how we're going to interact with our environment and with our experiences. We make that conscious volitional choice. For example, how we're going to interact with this person. Are we going to be kind to them, or are we going to be standoffish? Are we going to be positive, or are we going to be negative? We are making those volitional choices all the time, and this is what we call karma. And this is where the ethics of Buddhism comes into, these volitional choices that we make in our interaction with the environment. So it is not true to actually say it is just our environments and we're a reaction and result of our environment, but it's an interaction and moral choice that we do in our relationship with the environment. But again, I won't go into this too much because I'm not going to have much to talk about in 2 weeks' time. Okay, if anyone has any kind of queries or problems about what I've said, then you can maybe speak to me afterwards. I have not said this as a dogma. The Buddha's teachings on karma and rebirth are not a dogma. It is something to consider, to contemplate, to investigate. Is this true? Can this be known? Can I investigate this phenomena? Because the Buddha was taking the understanding and knowing and looking at truth, not the believing of something as a dogma in itself. Okay, now, is there any announcements, Dennis?
Thank you very much, Ajahn Nyanadhammo. Hello, everybody. Phil, could we just have the lights up a touch there, please, just so I can just see some of the dates that I've got. Just a couple of quick reminders for things that are coming up in the future. First of all, just to let you know that tonight the registration forms are available for the next 10-day retreat that we're running, and that retreat will be on March the 1st to the 3rd over the weekend, and it's going to be down at Safety Bay again. Very pleasant place for a weekend retreat. These spaces go very quickly, so anyone interested in joining that retreat in March, you can find some registration forms tonight over on the notice board. Also, just like to let you know that our GIA workers, the social workers we have working here, are arranging a Health Through Natural Medicine lecture here on Friday the 9th of February at 4:30. That'll be over in the community hall. There is a notice about this on the notice board. If anybody's interested in coming along to that on a Friday afternoon, late Friday afternoon, on February the 9th, please look that up on the notice board. And also just to remind you again about our food fair, which a number of members are putting a lot of effort into, and it's going to be quite a fantastic day. So just to make sure that you've got that date penciled aside, Saturday the 17th of February, there'll be sweet, sour and spicy is the name of the day. There's tickets available over at the reception desk or from Michael, our committee man Michael. The day will also include a cultural show, always very, very, very good, very skillful cultural show. And on this particular day too, there's a few other extra festivities I see, plus camel rides out there in the park. Also, just to remind you, the AGM on February the 24th for all full members. We'd really like to see you along to that to make the numbers and make it a healthy and good meeting. And just lastly, just like to mention for the Cancer Support Association, they're having on Saturday, February the 24th, in fact the same day as our AGM, so I hope the full members don't get too involved with this, but a meditation-a-thon is being held by them. The idea is to raise some money for them, I guess, and they have various meditation teachers from around Perth coming along to offer their services for that day, and the idea is you go along and put in usually hour-long sessions, I think, from early morning until late at night. But having attended one of these before, it does give you the opportunity to see various types of meditation. They have various sorts of meditation teachings that go on that day, and it's just a good opportunity to go along, donate some money to them, and just enjoy the day. Oh, I lied, it's not the last announcement. I just wanted to let you know too that the introduction to meditation starts again tomorrow. As you probably start to realise now, these introduction to meditation classes come around once a month. There are 4 weekly sessions, and the first one is beginning again tomorrow. So if anyone wants to come along and be part of that first one again tomorrow, or if you know somebody that wants to come and learn meditation, this is the ideal opportunity to come and join in here.
Pay our respects. Arahant Samma Sambuddha Bhagava Buddhaṃ Bhagavaṃ Abhivādin Svagata Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammaṃ Namasami Upadipana